Yeah. All right. I can just be really loud too. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. Hopefully you're enjoying the conference. I see a lot of familiar faces here. It's good to see all y'all. Just kick off the entire session and then get to what we're doing today. We are starting the session here this morning for strategy development and optimizing data science. There's a lot to that. I think that all of you are aware that data science sort of has become the way in which we try to gain knowledge from our data and drive science forward. So this should be a really interesting session, and so we're going to kick it off with I'm going to call it a ruckus panel about FAIR. So that's what we decided to do this morning. So
that's the art.
And so what we're really talking about is sort of the future of data science and biomedicine. The title, New Approaches to Make FAIR a Reality. The four of us, among others, talk about this a lot with each other. If you'll notice on the slides down there at the bottom, we've got a system set up, Slido, so that people online and here can submit questions in advance, sort of as you're thinking about them. And if you're in the room or online and you want to join that discussion, go to the microphone or go just chime in as needed. But I'll be watching Slido over here so that we can moderate that. So I'll lead off. My name's Ari Berman. I'm CEO of Bioteam, and my background really is science and technology. So I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I've been designing, building, and operating high-performance computing infrastructure for about 30 years. And really, my whole goal is to help science just go faster. And so FAIR is a really interesting topic with that. So and been involved with FAIR for quite a long time, mostly thanks to these folks. So I'll pass it off to Matthew, and let you go.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Trunnell. I've also been in the sort of biomedical IT data space for quite a long time. I think most relevantly, kind of starting about 6 or 7 years, no, longer ago than that. How long ago? It was 2018. Anyway, a long time ago. 5 years. I came into this, so it must be longer than that, came into this conversation about data sharing, and I came into it through my role at a cancer center, realizing, wow, none of us in the cancer center world actually have enough data to do what we want to do now that we have all these great computational approaches. And so the conversation around data sharing had been going on for about a decade at that point, and always ended with, well, incentives are not aligned and we can't do it. And then we started to talk about data commons and started to bring some ideas in about, well, maybe there really is value in sharing data, and there's some examples of things that are going on. And then we got into, well, making data, really allowing for data to be reused. It has to do with applying a lot of metadata, and we don't know how to do that very consistently, and we don't know, no one likes to do it. Mm-hmm. And the FAIR principles came out as, well, here's a framework for how to think about this. And so now we've been talking FAIR for a couple of years, and we'll talk about it for at least another hour here. But FAIR is kind of still a pretty low bar for what it is that the promise of what it is that we're trying to do, which is really to fully leverage all of the value and data that are generated. And so that is what I think about a lot now in different contexts, and that's why I'm here. So,
cool. Do I have to? I'm just going to assume this is on. All right, cool. I'm Kirsten Vagnon. I am actually funded by the Department of Energy. And I'm wondering how many people in the room actually know that the Department of Energy was involved in the Human Genome Project. Got one hand in the back. That's exciting. Now you all know that. So the next time someone asks, you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. Why would that be the case? We, Manhattan Project, right? Blowing stuff up, radiation does questionable things to the body. So it was something that people wanted to understand. And so it was one of these rare instances of agencies working together. So why am I still here? DOE, clean energy, but we've been looking at things like, plants and microbes. Probably everyone here has heard of the microbiome. But we look at that in things that are non-human, like the environment, like the soil, to help things grow. And I work at a DOE national user facility called the Joint Genome Institute. We take people's samples and then we provide sequence and analysis back. And you can imagine that with sequencing getting cheaper, that means that we generate more data. And part of what really motivates me is seeing that data get reused. All of our data winds up in SRA. And so one of the coolest things that we've been doing lately that we'll talk a little bit about here is looking at that downstream reuse and seeing how data generated in this Department of Energy mission space gets used for all kinds of weird and cool stuff. And that's part of this R in FAIR, and really understanding what makes it possible and easier for people to reuse that data helps us feel like, it's amplifying our mission.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Vivian Benazzi. I'm a biologist that went to the dark side of computing. That's probably the best description of me. I'm going to take up your comment from the Human Genome Project. So I actually worked for Celera Genomics, and I saw it from a different perspective, where we were generating a great deal of data, a huge volume of data, but storage was an issue, but management as well. So quite aside whether you're a company or a government organization, those things are really important, and it became acutely important for us for both the compute and storage. I spent many years at NIH as well, and part of the reason I went there was because they're running many biomedical programs that generate a great deal of data. The focus of NIH is quite rightly biomedical research, but the understanding of the need for data is still fairly nascent. I think they're making great strides. So Matthew described the data commons concepts and those kind of things. So I think the need for how you handle data aside from its biomedical intended use or use case is really important for reusability. I'm back now in industry, and I now work at Deloitte, and I run a biomedical data science team. And I work across all of HHS. So I work with a number of different health agencies, and they all have exactly the same problem. It's different flavor, but it's the same problem. The last thing I would say, and I think it's going to come up in our conversation today, is when you're looking at data, it gets really complex, particularly if you're not in it. And the C-suites or the people in the highest leadership positions often don't understand very much about data, and they're either overly or underly influenced, depending on what you take, from IT, data, et cetera, and they're not often making the decisions that are best for their organizations. And then you have a whole lot of sellers that come along with the, I call it the SaaS stack plethora. And I'm noticing that a lot of our clients, they've bought 8 of these things and they don't work together. I'm not surprised, but the incentives are not aligned for these to work together. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about those pieces as well today. So I hope this panel will kind of give us a flavor of different things. And we all know each other quite well, so apparently we're going to be raucous, is that right?
Irreverent even, yeah.
And I don't know, one of those,
Should
I
be-
can't say R, so R. R.
Awesome. All right. So we have some slides to sort of guide the conversation. Anyone should feel free to break in at any time. But what we thought we would do, maybe. How do I
Good
advance?
leading, thank you.
Can I do it?
No, that's different. That's for you all.
It's
it's
for
in
us.
Oh, sweet.
That's for us.
So I gotta go back.
Can you remember?
Crib notes.
Oh, I see. The clicker.
If.
Got it.
We should have actually asked the audience.
Actually, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Accept.
Let's recite the FAIR principles. Ready?
Yeah, not just the top level 4.
All right. So what we're gonna start with is just to ground everyone in what is fair, or at least how we view fair. Okay, see if that works now. Yes, excellent. Yay. All right. And so I think who doesn't know what FAIR is in this room? Good, that's what I thought. So obviously it stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And what we've done here is just list out what the FAIR principles are. I don't think people think about that very much. I think people sort of understand, okay, well, findable is, you got to find the data. If your data is on a USB stick in a drawer, it's not findable, right? I heard, with the NIH, data management and sharing plan that came out, one of the people responsible for that said that, people are sort of, what did she say? Maliciously compliant with that. And so,
That's what M stands for.
yeah, exactly, right. So what is findable? We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think everyone knows, but who would like to take the FAIR principles for findable?
I'll start, but
You got the kryptonite.
how many people actually, yeah, I know, I couldn't do it otherwise, but yeah, how many people actually know how many FAIR principles there are? Like you ask most people and they'll say 4, right? Because that's how we generally interpret them. And the original paper that offered these actually thought about this pretty hard. And I keep trying to redirect people to this because it's worth thinking
So
about this.
2016, the Wilkinson paper.
Thank you. Yep. So this idea of findability is very much about metadata but being able to not just access metadata, but to be able to rely on metadata. And I think that's really a key piece. So persistent metadata, even if the data themselves go away, the metadata have to continue to exist. And that has big implications for infrastructure and how you manage things. So this idea of a globally unique identifier, and there are different approaches to doing this, DOIs, other things, that metadata include sufficient context to enable their discovery. So that will depend very differently on different kinds of data. And here, it actually works to have somewhat unstructured data, which I really kind of favor as a class of metadata. So think hashtags and keywords that are associated that actually really enable a kind of discovery when you don't know exactly what it is that you're looking for. But yeah, so that's findability. And we think that's the easiest one because in general, we think search is solved. And to those that believe that, I invite you to the Google dataset search if you haven't looked at it. So Google indexes a bunch of data sets, and it's really hard to find things there unless you know exactly what you're looking for, because the data in there are not representing these principles. All right, I guess you get A.
But I feel like you just mentioned one of the key parts of A, which is the metadata is there even when the data doesn't exist anymore. You've got this persistent resource. And I actually would like to, again, poll the audience here. How many people would say that, how many people here have generated their own data at some point? Awesome. How many of you then put that data into a repository? How many of you enjoyed putting the data into a repository? Yeah, and how many of you felt really good and confident that the metadata associated with that data you put into the repository were awesome? Yeah, that's right. Like it's painful. And like he was saying, it's not a lot of fun, but sometimes that's the only persistent artifact from this work that you've done that lets other folks take advantage of it. And not only that, data on a computer all looks the same when you're talking about, the compiler level, right? Or how it's stored. It's that context around it that matters. But you can chat. I see Tom Madden's in the audience. One of the things that, with sequence data, when the metadata is terrible, there's still information in that sequence data, right? You can still pull that out. And we've got these great might be a stretch, but we've got reference databases with information that lets you identify what that sequence is. And so there are multiple ways to attack the search problem, but then it is only interesting if you can kind of then step back and think about where that data was collected from, how that was done, because you'll observe patterns and you'll want to explain them, right? And so without that, you can't do it. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. Everyone wants everyone else's data to have really good metadata. I would like even my own to have good metadata, but sometimes then I look at something I generated a few weeks ago and I'm like, what did I do? Where did that come from? And just, look at your laptops, for example, right? It's like, ooh, all right. If you've had it for a while and you've been doing backups, there might be stuff in your documents folder you don't remember writing. And sometimes I look at it and think, wow, that was pretty amazing. I don't know who wrote that. Oh, it was me. And so I think this just emphasizes the importance of having that metadata so you can find and access things later. Like that really enhances the search. Content-driven search is really awesome, but then it limits the utility of what you can do. And I hate the I part of FAIR because I still don't understand it years later. So I'm really glad that Vivian's going to take that on right now.
I'm not.
Yeah, you got it.
I'm
You can do
happy
the I
you're
and the
taking it on,
R
too.
because the R is fun.
I can't pronounce any of it.
Yeah.
But I know these people well. So I'm going to just add a bit on the A. I can.
Great.
No, hang on, not on the F. We're still on the F, right? So everyone raised their hand. You've all been doing data, right? So none of you put your hand up when you were like, except the lady in blue who seemed to enjoy putting metadata in. I want to talk to you later. It's like something puzzle.
That's right.
But
Yes.
you need, we're being videotaped. I won't say anything Australian to you. Anyway, it is a painful process, right? And everyone said, you all understand it, all the rest of it. My question to you is, it's painful in part because the process is painful to wrangle the data, right? How many people in your organization in the leadership understand it? How many people give you the time to do it, real time, not, how many of you experienced this? Oh, you've got the data? Why isn't it in the database, resource, whatever, when you got it about an hour before? Right, see, heads nodding. So I don't know if you want to put it in Slido or if anyone wants to ask a question, but part of the problem that we're seeing is not just the time it takes to wrangle data. It's much sexier to say you're a data scientist than a data wrangler, but that's what I've spent a lot of my life doing, and you have too. But it's the organizational culture at the leadership level, understanding the value of doing that and giving you the time and the resources in order to do that. Yes, you can over-polish something. What is good enough, right? Is it fair enough? I just made that up. But I think that that's a really important part of what we have to discuss as well, which is the culture of our organizations at the top level, understanding the value of doing this and giving the time and resources to do it. And then the other one is, whatever your world is, in my world, I'll deal with IT, I'll deal with C-suites, etc. They all see the world, it's like an elephant where you're not sure which part you've got. Having the ability to talk to each other in a meaningful way with respect and understanding the value that you all bring to each other is another part. When that happens in an organization, then the resources align. And there's nothing better than working in an organization that gives you the time to do that or safeguards your time to get that data to the place where the metadata is pretty good. And I think that's a really key point. I know we were talking about it before. It'll probably come up, some of the things. Do I have to do A now? Or have I done, we go back to Matthew and do A?
Yeah, well, I can roll forward here a little bit. So,
Great.
So really, I'll just, talk about interoperable for a second is the idea. So how many of you who are data scientists spend almost all of your time harmonizing data or cleaning data?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who like can just use your data right away? Yeah, so nobody, right? The reality is that it takes most data scientists that I've talked to over the years spend about 80% of their time cleaning, harmonizing, making data ready to analyze if it's not from a single experiment, which it almost never is. So even just to match data that you are producing to the reference data sets that are out there takes a lot of effort, a lot of transformation, a lot of, everyone I think knows ETL, right? That sort of thing. And the problem is if the data is not accessible in the way that we're talking about here, right? Which is did it go back? No, there we go. If it's not accessible in the way we're talking about here, which means the metadata are retrievable, it's there are metadata describing the data, and somewhat there are standards for those metadata and the data that cross the domains of the scientific area. Then it's not interoperable. So I think we'll bring this up later, but the main incarnation of this so far has been data commons. Data commons are great. They're also silos of excellence sometimes. Sometimes they're just silos, right? So the problem is the interoperability is really hard, especially when there are no agreed upon data standards in life sciences or biomedicine, right? There are standards, there's just 38 of them and everyone thinks there's the best, right? So
I want to take a little bit of exception here.
Okay.
So I is one that trips up people a lot, I think, because you can conceive of what one might need to do to make data interoperable. And it's hard, like the context around that, and it really spills over. Really what FAIR calls for is the use of ontologies and the use of standard vocabularies. And that's actually not, I mean, it's true that there's not a global set of recognized standards across all these different data types, but bringing that into your process of data generation and using the existing vocabularies in human-related data. There are libraries of so-called common data elements, which themselves are referenced to standard vocabularies and ontologies. That is the focus of the interoperability. So it's that part is accessible. I mean, is wrong word. That part is actually achievable in the literal sense of the I as articulated in this context. Is that enough to accomplish what it is that we all are hoping happens at some point, that really data becomes sufficiently liquid that we can do anything we might want to with it? No. Again, I think FAIR is a low bar, in all honesty. I mean, I think it's a low bar and not nearly enough for what we need to do.
But as we were talking about earlier, that bar is a bar we like to stand back and stare at.
Yep.
And talk about. So,
Exactly.
you know, we're not, in some levels, we're approaching the bar, but as a low bar, we still have some work.
You have a low bar.
Yeah, I feel this. Oh my God, I didn't do that. Or I must have. Sorry, that was a little shocking. I just wanted to make sure everyone was awake. So I understand the argument in favor of ontologies. I understand the potential utility of those and standards if people actually use them. And I would argue we potentially need better tools to help folks use them. And I know that lots of people are working on that. But one of the tricky things is there's still room for interpretation when you're applying ontological terms to your data. And it's a moving target that you're always going to discover edge cases and outliers. I think there are minimal sets of data, like the mix standards, I think are a cool example. You have lots of things for different environments. But I'm not a biologist. I'm a mathematician by training and computer scientist by training. And one of the things that has been really fun for me is to have interactions with environmental scientists who have lots of different words for dirt. Things that look the same to me, they've got all this nuance around it. And so I think that can be a little bit tricky, but fundamentally, you know, if it's dirt and you're interested in dirt and interested in what came from the dirt and that it's all from a similar place, that's probably enough to get you started, right? So that's kind of another example of this being the low bar. And I just, one of the other things that's been striking to me over the last month, so again, math backgrounds, I like physics, I like partial differential equations, I like that structure of having this kind of predictive system. And I had thought to myself, I was telling these folks earlier, I was like, well, you know, if the big problem is metadata for folks going out and collecting environmental samples, I'm going to build a robot that'll just go out and collect the samples and the metadata and in, you know, a future state. I mean, wouldn't it be cool? Just imagine lots of Mars rovers out there collecting samples if you're interested in the environment. And let's say they've got sequencers on board and mass specs, and they can just shoot that data up to a satellite, and then we all have access to it because no human was out there doing it. So we can get all the information from the robots. And then someone pointed out to me that sometimes when they're out collecting this, you know, dirt or soil information, they want to observe other things. This is why self-driving cars are hard, because you can't predict all the stuff that's going to happen on the roadway. And I was like, oh, my robot would have to observe whether or not there are cats present, or, other types of animals that just happen to be swooping in because that's relevant. And when a scientist goes out in the field, there's more that like their instincts are telling them about that particular field or that dirt or that soil. And so that objectivity that I like from my math and my PDEs isn't necessarily there in this experimental science. And I'm curious, about what the room thinks about this, because there's experimental design in everything. And I don't know, maybe we'll eventually get to where there's more math, but that's something that's been kicking around in my head lately, because I think to get to this long-term view of like, I can use someone else's data, you have to also appreciate their headspace a little bit of like, oh, they were looking for, I don't know why I'm going back to cats in the dark, but it's fine. It's a little early.
Is that the
for me.
lead in for cats?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so I'm
Anyway,
gonna.
sorry.
This
Yeah.
is like one of those games, I think. So I have nothing to say about cats right now, but
Okay,
I'll think
later.
about it. So I think what you say though about cats, I've already thought about that. When you're collecting metadata, right? I'm a biologist that went the other way, and I did a lot of work in the math physics department. I learned a couple of things. Many biologists that I worked with were not as quantitative. It's not a bad thing, it just is. But they think differently. So I remember one example I had was pH meters in the lab. They would usually calibrate over multiple points. To me, it was obvious that you can draw any straight line through one point, but you need multiple points. That was the first time I recognized that not everyone thinks the same way. So to your point about quantitativeness, you don't have that always to that degree in some of the bio community. That's not a bad thing. No. The flip side of that is when you're looking at the metadata, and if you're just coming at it from a pure math physics point of view, context is important. What you collected is really important. You have a lot of phenotype information that's often in your head from many years of doing science. So that can help you literally use your human brain computer to differentiate some of the metadata. I found that I was doing that, and I used it to build programs which helped me to be better informed. But it's coming together. Again, it's that language of being able to translate those things, because I can find many data scientists that can code in Python and R. I talk to young people all the time, but it's the application of those things and understanding to applying it to the data which is critical. So I don't always need people that are pure data scientists in my team. I need ones that are willing to listen and understand context. And I need the biologist in my team to understand and create the space for those people who are more quantitative. When that happens, there's friction, misunderstanding, but sometimes magic happens too. You see a couple of things. Innovation comes out, and I think the younger team members are really starting to feel a sense of team. And I found every project that I work on that has that sense of team is always better, always. Because when difficulties arise with whatever project you're going on, it's that team spirit that allows you to pull things together. So I think it's a cultural thing we have to pay attention to, as well as the content. One more thing about, you mentioned I. So I agree, we're on to I, we skipped A. Interoperability is hard. People talk about it a lot, but I think people interpret it, which is what you said. And this is the cat's piece again. Oh, you said I. Sorry.
I'm delighted that I'm already being confused with you.
I'm being
This is
confused.
great.
Well, my thought about cats there is it's like herding cats, right?
You did it.
The problem, I did it. I don't know how I did it. The problem I see is FAIR is this low bar, but often the pressures of an organization, be they academic or commercial, is to get to an outcome and quickly. So you may want to pay attention to FAIR, but you often don't have the time frame to be able to do that. So you make it fair enough, number one. I know you said this about ontologies, and you said this about the interpretation. I guess I'm the weaver of all of this stuff. I'm just making it up. When you have ontologies, which I think are really essential, and you have a very short time frame, you can interpret them because of your own type of data, and you're forced to create an interpretation or a shortcut simply because of the shorter time frame. And the result of that is silos. I'm going back now to ARI. I guess I'm pulling it all together. What will happen is you create these silos. Somebody's used an ontology X and somebody's used ontology Y, or then done a code fork on that. The issue becomes then that we create more and more silos because we don't have the time and attention to pay to actually doing this. Now, you don't want to spend 5 years doing verification of data. No organization has that time. but you need to be able to give it some time. Because I think part of the problem we're getting with FAIR is people are starting to really think about it and do it, but then these platforms or systems are starting to come up which are uniquely aligned to a particular organization. And we'll probably get to this later. I'm on a roll here, guys. Data governance.
Good, yeah.
When you have a system, whether it be a platform or whatever you're doing, that's inserting its own version of FAIR, it creates a data governance around that. And the owners of those data, be they an agency, a client, whoever it is, they're out of the loop. And it's forcing the structure of that data according to whatever that group was doing that was doing it. The problem with that is the ownership goes away from the people that were generating the data, and it creates a cycle of essentially more silos. So I think all of that to say that we have to think about what FAIR means and the time frame to actually insert it into our systems, both technically, engineering-wise, and culturally with our leaders in our organizations. That conversation has to happen to allow us to stop creating these cylinders of excellence. So back to you. See you later.
Okay, back to me. Awesome. All right, so we have about 25 minutes left. Clearly, we can talk about this all day. So I'm going to sort of gloss through reusable because we're just not there in reality.
All right.
Come on.
Okay.
Hold on.
Just,
I'm talking about as a whole. We're not.
okay, so that's like a really high bar to set if you want everyone's data.
I
to be
do.
Just, I mean, that's,
So
you're
let's
saying low bar.
low bar. Okay. The goal of all of this is the reuse of data, right? The goal of FAIR is to be able to effectively reuse data. The shiny vision in the future is that data is just analysis ready, right? Who here is enamored by AI at the moment?
I'm not enamored.
Like, we'll have robots,
Yes, robots,
AI bots.
AI bots.
They're going to
yes.
do everything.
They're already. Yeah.
Look at that thing's following us, and it's a bird dog camera
Yes.
thing. See, it's,
Turned
yeah,
away.
it's
Offended it.
just
pretty
yeah, it's
amazing.
upset with me.
So
now.
it's a little disturbing. The bottom line is that if we're going to regain the efficiency of discovery and creating knowledge from data, right, we actually have to solve these problems somewhat universally, right? And so I think that I'm going to sort of move forward so that we can get through the rest of our 7 slides. And
I have to put a comment.
go ahead.
Yeah.
So again, FAIR is a low bar. It doesn't solve everything. And particularly if you work with human data at all, if you work with clinical data, it is impossible to provide enough metadata to fully contextualize that data because
That's true.
we don't know how to quantify a human system yet. It's an open system, and we can't actually reduce the state of a person to fully computable data. And so again, FAIR is important. Ontologies are useful, but what it's going to take to really get us to the point where we can work more globally on some of these problems around that require accessing data from lots of places is a lot of collaboration and thinking and work that goes well beyond FAIR. So I want to stress FAIR is not the end at all.
No, well,
It is the place to have the conversation.
Do companies want to collaborate?
depends on
I
who
mean,
you ask.
I've got a government perspective and I want all our data to be public, but I feel like maybe that's not the case if you're in industry.
I think it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
So I'm Mark Rubenfield with the Pistoia Alliance on Matter.
Yes,
Hi,
hi.
Mark.
And the Pistoia Alliance is all about pre-competitive collaboration.
Yeah.
Multiple
Could-
organizations.
Mark, can you come up to the mic? There's people online, so
Yeah.
we want to make
And,
sure.
and
that
this
they-
is actually, this is
right.
super important. Like, this is the stuff.
And what you're doing actually answers that question. some more.
Right,
So-
that's
Yeah.
why I was
Yes.
trying to do that. Anyway, Mark Rubenfield with the Pistoia Alliance. We're a nonprofit that really encourages pre-competitive collaboration to answer lots of the questions that we've had up here today. what we'd like to do, I mean, we have 17 of the top 20 pharmas. We have over 200 members. So the answer is everybody likes the idea of collaboration. The challenge is, how do we get there? So
It's,
How do you align incentives? Because that's part of it, and they're different between different groups.
and one of the things that we're looking at is how do we provide value? What's the value of collaboration? So to each, so there are interesting projects, happy to talk about it, but really those are the challenges that we're looking at.
absolutely. And thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that was a great example. So the answer to your question is it depends on who you ask.
No, I just
If,
wanted to
if you
hear
ask
from
the lawyers,
audience.
probably not. If you ask marketing, probably not, right? But I think the R&D groups kind of need to. And here's why, right? So collaboration is a fundamental tenet of scientific method, right? And one of the reasons it is, and especially now, the complexity of data being collected and the complexity of systems being researched has reached such a level that I don't think there are very many individuals or even individual labs that can make sense of it all. So collaboration actually is necessary to really contextualize this information, because as was said earlier, you can't reduce it to a computable thing yet. There's a lot of intuition. There's a lot of association that happens in our brains that you can't do in computers yet, and from experience and things like that.
I want to point out too that collaboration is not the only driver here. So there are very real market drivers. Look at AWS Data Marketplace. There are companies that have private data that are being offered up for use. There are companies like Truveta that are, and Datavant and Healthverity, and a lot of these whose business is monetizing data. And I'm not saying anything but for or against that. It's just that it's a really interesting new driver. We've been trying to drive this very much from this academic view of collaboration is good and people should be doing it, even though we're not incentivized to do it very well. But in the world now, and this is relatively recent, over the last handful of years, that data, particularly health data, are starting to find real commercial traction. And so I welcome that as a driver of this process.
Can I prompt you for something we were talking about before? I agree. So I think we're in a digital economy, and the key is economy. So there are ways to monetize the data that don't tie it down. I work with some organizations which are like health nonprofits that have data products that are very important to pharma companies. They would license them not exclusively. So you can mine the data, but there's a cost associated to that, and the cost is scalable. So for example, raw data in itself would require often the buyer, for the better term, of the data to do a lot of data to data wrangle. But if the data is in a form that is consumable by who's going to take it, that's worth more, because they have to do less work on that data to get it in a usable form. So I've had experience of this where I've worked with various pharma companies and they like it in format X and they only want it once a quarter and they whatever it is that you want. When you do that, the dollar value goes up, but it's still non-exclusive. The work comes on your side. So there's that. There's also the bit you were describing about Bitcoin that we talked about. So there's, in a digital economy, the data has its own transaction. You can see it in multiple different ways. By what I just said, there's also not just data slices, but also representation of that data, reuse of that metadata. You want to talk about the Bitcoin? We talked about it this morning.
I'll just mention, so people have talked about using blockchain to enable sharing of health data for many years. The one approach that actually has traction right now that I'm super fascinated by is molecule.io. If you haven't seen it, so their business model is basically wrapping IP in NFT, and that IP can be personally contributed medical data. And the idea is when you have a large enough corpus of data to interest research in it, then there are real dollars that flow in, and that gets reflected then in the value of the NFT. And it's early, but it's working, at least in a couple of really unique cases. interesting to think about fair in that context, but I don't want to go too far down this.
So
this
that-
rabbit hole,
yeah.
but
First of all, I said Bitcoin, I meant blockchain. My
Yep.
apologies.
No,
But I
okay.
think the point is that you've got essentially microtransactions occurring as opposed to giant blob of data that has to be exchanged with giant blob of data. And I think microservices, another sort of that, where you're not looking at these ginormous pieces, but essentially Lego blocks of pieces that can work on data in particular ways that can be reassembled, or microtransactions that can be secure, are all signs of being able to handle the economy. And I think the companies that understand that, not just from a monetization point of view, but understand that flow of how that fits, is going to be really important. I also think that it's important for the funding agencies to understand those, not just the technologies, but the application of that workflow into it. That's your cue. Oh, back to Matthew.
Well, yeah, so,
Anyway.
the slide up here says why fair, but I want to bring something up that's important here, is fair possible? From a technology standpoint, absolutely. Do we have the technology today? Yes. Is it easy? No, not at all, especially if you're looking at legacy data, right? Data that's been around for, I don't know, up to 200 years that may still be on paper somewhere. And, I think a lot about how much information and data is locked in publications, right? That is not a computable state. That is really hard to get information out of there. And it's in, PDFs, sometimes image PDFs somewhere in a repository, these days. So that's a huge, problem, because in a lot of, especially life sciences research, the end state of research is publication. So, because that's what gets you grants, that's what gets you refunded, that's what gets you, your new projects, approved by leadership, but depending on the organization you're at. And that information is not fair at all, unless you sit down and literally read every paper, which is not really possible. So is fair possible from a technology standpoint? I say yes. From a people standpoint, I say not yet. We are not incentivized to do it.
See?
I did it again.
It's not me.
It was me.
Yeah.
I'm not touching
You two and these microphones.
But there's,
You can argue we
It's
don't need
unfair.
them. Yeah, it's not.
Yes.
I would like to point out that FAIR is working in some cases.
Agreed.
Yep.
That's the next slide.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And I do also believe that, foundation models, these LLMs, are
Yes.
today already going after that,
Yeah.
that historical data trove and text.
Agreed.
Will those data be fair?
It'll be findable.
So, yep, so we start to work our way down
Yep.
the chain. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's interesting. But yes, successes.
Well, so let's see. Oh, myths.
Oh,
Yes, fair myths. There. So there's a lot of myths, I think, about fair. I had a bunch this morning.
Yeah.
I was thinking of.
So I'm
So
going to have to read them out.
fair principles are metrics that are easy to evaluate. How do you evaluate fair? We've tried this a few times in a few different ways, right? In the project that shall not be named from NIH, the system was built called Fair Shake, which is a way to build a rubric around how to evaluate the fairness of your data or your data set. It was interesting. But can you quantify fairness? Which, is the next thing. Everyone agrees on what fair means and how to implement it. No. Y'all want to jump in on that?
We don't even, so
We don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fun.
We don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
agree on what fair means and how to implement that agree.
But it's a nice word, right? We all like the idea of fairness, but then we also all know that life is not fair, right? Our parents told us that from a very young age. So it's complicated.
Yep, agreed.
But I think it's a good. I'm not touching this.
Yeah, right?
I think it's a good conversation to have. It's an important one. I don't think we've solved it, but I think the very fact that we're having the conversations around all of this and it's messy, that's human nature. And it's more complicated because you're also involving humans with different sets of skills, with different incentives and different alignments and timelines. And I think it's just going to take time. I think also what's going to come out of it is innovation. We're already seeing that. And it's never going to be a perfect system. But the fact that this is allowing us to have the conversations that we need to have, I think is a step in the right direction. 25 years from now at this conference, there'll be a different conversation around whatever the new thing's going to be.
Let's hope.
Oh,
Yes.
there's praying going up here.
Yeah. I'll just read off the rest of these. Science will be fixed if everything is fair. No. Everyone wants to make their data fair. Clearly not. All right. Otherwise, I think we'd be a lot closer. But to be fair, if we're talking about people and incentives, people are not incentivized to it. And what Vivian was saying earlier about leadership allowing this to happen or creating the space for it to happen, it's not, right? Things have to be produced, you got to move. This is hard. And it's not something that's going to happen quickly, and it does need to be incentivized. And to the point of monetization, as someone who has gone totally to the dark side from academic research to trying to run a company, I can say that if you want something to happen, figure out how to make money from it. So how do we make money from FAIR? Then it'll probably happen a lot faster than it is right now. FAIR is a concept that helps data accessibility for the long tail of science. This is a soapbox I'm on, have been on for a while, is that most analytics tools in life sciences and biomedicine are designed by and for data scientists, people with a lot of computational sophistication. And the long tail of science, the folks in the laboratories, the folks who are generating the data, the folks who are designing the experiments a lot, I sort of joke about this, but they might be okay doing web, email, and printing things, but they don't know what a command line is, they don't know what an API is, and they sure aren't going to be able to use the Jupyter Notebook. So is FAIR going to fix that? No. And these are somewhat defining the low bar we're talking about, right? There's a lot more beyond that needs to happen in order for data to really be usable by the scientific community, which includes all the way out to citizen scientists. Right?
So I think there's a really good example that we've all seen recently. Has anyone heard about COVID-19?
What's that, Vivian?
Vaguely, yeah.
So to me, that was a fascinating, sad but fascinating experiment of the problem with FAIR, right? Here was a situation where early on, we didn't know if we were all going to die, right? Scary. So here's a situation that affects every single person, every single person's family member. And yet, we couldn't share data, certainly not in the United States. There were many reasons for that. And there's a couple of really interesting papers and actually very interesting NPR, I have no association with this, discussion around it. It really came down to a collection of people that had different skills, including journalists, who pulled together the data from the different states because we had no way to track this, right? So you can point fingers at agencies, you can do what you want, but when you're going to die, or you may die, or your family member may die, you start paying attention. And so what we got was a collection of people who I think essentially intrinsically believed in the shareability of data to try and help human beings. We also had a collection of people that didn't see necessarily the value in that. Either I can't do that, there's a bureaucratic reason for doing that, there's too many barriers, there's sort of a lot of non-productive thinking. There was also an example of early on where the companies wanted to share the data because we all needed a vaccine of some description. So there was a level of shareability because we all wanted to live. But there's also a level of competition where people wanted to make money. So when those two things intersect, I think we have a pretty good example of where we really should have been fair really quickly, and it wasn't.
It was not.
It was absolutely not. On top of that, I think what we see is we've now gone back to the splintered fair or my fair, right? Because COVID's gone away, right? We're all sitting in this, right? We're sitting here not wearing masks. We feel safe enough. But what happens when we get the next one? how are we going to take what we've learned from this to take those people that really did something here to help us and help our society in data overall, but at the same time leave the space for innovation? And I think companies can help in innovation as well. I think we could have, and we should be learning from these things where agencies, commercial companies, individuals, journalists can get together and have these conversations as a storyline to help us overall. And I think the pandemic is one example, but there will be others which I think affect all of us as humans. And I'd like to see where that story would come. Right now, what we're hearing from various sources, exactly where it went wrong. But where can we figure out how to go right? I think that's going to be a really important thing for the next step.
Can we talk about something happy for a moment?
Oh,
Yes.
cats.
I don't know how this room is feeling. I think it's very real, and we're not going to solve the challenges of human nature. But this slide, which I can't see because there are like Slido things up right now, is an example of some weirdness. And I think that's pretty fun. So like I said, Joint Genome Institute, we've generated a lot of data. You know, you're probably all mostly familiar with the human genome, but we do lots of stuff with cool microbes. I don't know if anyone else in the audience knows this, but there are microbes that secrete perfect magnets. Isn't that cool? They all have superpowers. These things we can't see drive our existence. We all felt that with COVID-19, but they are way cooler than us. And so understanding what they do and how they do it and how we might use that for things like a bioeconomy, I think is really fascinating. But to this idea of reuse, there's a genome that got produced back in 2007. That's a while ago. I can't do that math either, so don't feel bad. And so it was a bacterium, and then more analysis gets done, and it conducts photosynthesis using this red-shifted light. So when you're thinking about that, we've got bugs on our planet that know how to deal with the light that's coming to Earth. But if you want to think about doing things in places like Mars, where the light is really red, we're going to need to understand potentially how to use that light too. But what I think is very cool about this is you've got a big 11-year time difference in the reuse of the data. People found it because SRA exists. Right? There's a national repository that exists. The data's out there. They didn't have to go sequence that microbe themselves. The Department of Energy, I don't know if we're interested in terraforming Mars. It doesn't seem part of our mission space, but scientists are able to reuse that to do really fascinating and cool stuff that we never would have anticipated. And to get at this idea of culture change, wouldn't you all be really fascinated if you had been responsible for this genome and suddenly someone's using it when thinking about space, because space is awesome? But when you ask people now, in this moment, you're generating a data set, you're probably not that worried about reuse. To everyone's point about incentives, you're worried about getting that publication out and getting your next set of funding. But if it became part of what you could do to tell these stories about how the data you generated actually led to these additional discoveries, I feel like that's really powerful and speaks to us as humans because we love storytelling. And then eventually, I'm using this to kind of influence the folks who give us money at the Department of Energy, and they all love these stories, right? Because normally we've been a little bit more constrained, or you don't get the time to share the metadata. That happens across the board. But if you start explaining that this is what's possible, and you come up, I have other examples. You guys can come talk to me if you want to. Some involve 6,000-year-old chewing gum, right? That's so weird. But somebody's looking at that, and it also gives you that connectivity to other science areas, which I think we all really like. So I just want to, bring up these positive cases of reuse. This is happening because there are identifiers, repositories exist. So the question is, how do we make this easier? Right? And that to me is what matters about FAIR. We're making that easier for people to do.
Thank you. This is the reason we care about this. This is why we're all up here. We can talk about the negative stuff. You're right. And the last few slides were meant to be positive, but we only have 5 minutes left.
I know.
So because we could really talk about this all day and have talked about it all day. So I'm going to actually, one example of success. You want to talk about this one?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, okay. So I was throwing things in there because we were trying to make slides.
Yes.
And I don't know if
There's more, but we didn't
yeah,
finish the
there's
slide.
and I feel like examples of success have been coming out throughout this conversation. But one of the things that can make standards a little hard to use is not having like a good structured format behind it, right? Like, you know, and so there's the Genome Mix Standards Consortium. They work on MixS, the minimum information for, you know, sequence data. And most recently, there was a collaboration between some data scientists and the folks who maintain the MixS standard, where they shifted it to be represented in LinkML so that it would be easier for people to build tools to do the validation against those standards. And that's just an important part, because if you're entering metadata, I know you all probably capture it in spreadsheets. It's okay. Or that's a step up from your lab notebooks, but send anyone a spreadsheet and they're like, cool, great. I don't, you know, that's not exactly easy to use. It's what we get from all of our users. But if you can take that, you can upload it into a system. And this is not a trivial thing to do in a usable, user-friendly way, but do that validation against something like a standard that's got your environment packages, again, environment worlds, or like the laboratory experiment that helps people start to use this same language for the ontologies too. And so that's just an example of things moving forward, technology driving it, that can help all of us in this room either use those tools more effectively or build them. So that, and like try different things to see what actually helps people collect that.
There's quite a few. So
Yeah.
you make a good point. So there's quite a few tools out there increasingly where people have used some form of standard or ontology, but somebody else has used another one, which is equally as valid. And those mappings are starting to happen. So there are tools to create the mappings, the ontology at the standard level, so that there's that I word, interoperability, right, between those. So it could be different systems, but the mapping's still valid. And I think there's many examples of that coming out, which I think are really going to help to create these transactions that occur between systems.
So we only have a couple more minutes, and we intended this to be far more interactive, so here we are. You know, there's a few things on Slido. Does anyone in the room have any comments, questions you want to jump up? Yeah, please. While you're getting up there, I'll read one of the Slidos, which was said, it was said negatively that 80% of the time is spent cleaning data, but isn't this the time where we learn and understand our data and the context of its creation? Agree 100%. Yes. That doesn't mean that we should make that easier and, you know, really spend time on the data. So,
all right. So you mentioned that LLMs might actually help, or maybe when you mentioned it would actually help accelerate achieving of FAIR, but I got very nervous about the hallucinations. And, you know, which of the principles covers correctness or truth, accuracy of the data? I mean, should we have FAIRT, IFART? No, that's bad. Sorry.
New acronym, it's flatulence. Is that right?
oh yeah, data quality is a big
that's
thing,
great.
right? And we don't talk about it or think about it, and it's really important.
Oh, I don't know why I'm getting pointed at.
I was pointing at all of you.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
You just happen to be looking.
I have a lot of healthy skepticism around ChatGPT and things like that. I think it's really fascinating to read the takes by folks like Gary Marcus, who've been thinking about like, okay, cool. We have an LLM that does a thing, been trained for a thing. How can we add reasoning and logic into that? There are also other LLMs that you can look at. One's named Koala. Maybe you all have seen this. I just think that's a really great name. Yes. And I brought up animals again. But that one has been trained on scientific literature and is a little bit better when you are doing queries at, you know, indicating the correctness or I have no idea. And so this is, I mean, it's a really interesting space. Like we put a ChatGPT interface in front of the National Microbiome Data Collaborative API so we could ask questions like, show me all your metagenomes. And that's how you can let people query that. So there's some power in being able to link those concepts, but doing it correctly is critical for science, right? And we're never going to get away from the human also having to use critical thinking. And that's the danger. I'm confident everyone in this room can think critically about a result that comes back from a computer, but that's not necessarily the case broadly, right? So, and I should stop talking.
I skipped over it, but the last myth on here was AI will solve FAIR for us, right? Because that's a myth. It's not going to.
But I think you raise a really important quality of data.
Yeah.
And the
really
accuracy of it, I think, is very important for a couple of reasons, right? Obviously the accuracy of it. The other one is what you said about models. You can over-bias your models even if your data is accurate. And that is actually another problem. So understanding how you're doing that is really critical. And I think, the great rage of generative AI that will solve everything, including make you toast, it's got a lot of momentum, but I think some caution there, not just from the sociological, ethical impacts, I think also, which are triggered by some of what I'm talking about now, but you've got to really think about those models for the accuracy, but also their bias in terms of just how you're biasing the data with the way you're building the model.
I mean, they can't add right now, right?
Yep.
That to me alone, I know it's my little math brain, and like I know it's probably trained on stuff where lots of humans can't add, and it's finding that information. It's like, well, maybe 1 + 1 is 2. It's coming from a probability distribution, and you're like, oh, wait a minute,
Which
right?
numeric system are you using?
Right? Yeah. So I mean, but it's really interesting to talk about and think about, right? And I think it's good for all of us in this room to develop an understanding, because we're going to have the same sort of communication and common language to talk about these things. And I'm just going to put in a plug again. We need more mathematical structure.
Yep.
Anyway.
Okay.
Yes. All right. We got math people in the room.
So we better stop because we got a new session coming in. I will go through the Slidos, those who put it on there, and reply to them on there. So keep looking for it. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for putting up with us for an hour.